Lean in. Close your eyes if you can. Imagine a corridor of time that doesn't run left to right, but down, like a shaft carved through rock, each step echoing with hymns in a language most of the world forgot to learn. I'm taking you there now, into the highlands where dawn burns like brass and church bells are struck, not to command an empire, but to wake the soul. Somewhere in that light, a monk turns a page that Europe never meant for you to see, and the breath of 1,000 years lifts the edges of a Ge'ez manuscript. If you listen closely enough, you'll hear it, in the scratch of ink, in the hum of prayer, the sound of a different Christianity still breathing. We've been taught a story, we've been told where to look and whom to trust, which faces to paint and which names to fear. But stories are power, and power chooses the stories that survive. So tonight, we are not just retracing history, we're reopening the spine of a version that survived in the mountains and in the mouths of people who did not need marble to make their faith stand. We are following a thread that begins in an open chariot on a desert road and disappears into a choir inside a stone church, then reappears centuries later when a traveler stumbled on a book the West swore was dead. If you've ever felt that something about the official story was too clean, too polished, too convenient, you are in good company. The truth is rarely a statue, it's a living thing, and living things refuse to sit still when empires try to pose them. So I want you to walk with me, scene by scene, breath by breath, through a landscape where Christ is not bleached into a palace icon, but looks like the people who call his name, where angels are not fairy tale ornaments, but agents whose choices spill into soil and kingship and childbirth and war, where the figure we were taught to name as Lucifer is less a cartoon villain and more a prosecutor in a courtroom that extends through the galaxies and right down into your chest. Look, there's Axum before sunrise. The streets still, the air thin. A priest passes carrying a tabor wrapped in cloth, the symbol of the Ark, a memory and a claim. The eyes of old men follow him with the quiet of people who learned a long time ago not to shout about precious things. On the hill, the church stands like a patient witness. There is a door in that church only one man may pass through in a lifetime sworn to silence. You may doubt the legend, but you cannot doubt the discipline that produced it. Empires teach fear, monasteries teach endurance. One leaves monuments, the other leaves memory. Horizons shift. We enter a library. Not a national archive with glass and lasers, but a room that smells of leather, frankincense, and rain rot. A deacon lights a taper and tilts it just close enough to show you the scarlet rubrications, the hands that copied the Book of Enoch when the West called it superstition. You see the scribe's marginalia, a date, a prayer for the patron who paid for the vellum, a plea for forgiveness if the line breaks stumble. The page turns. Names that feel like thunder roll out. Watchers, Nephilim, chains, caverns, stars kept in storehouses of judgment. This is not sanitized mythology. This is the sense that heaven's courtroom keeps meticulous records, and every oath or betrayal drops like ink onto a ledger you and I cannot edit. We don't linger because this is not a museum tour. It's a pursuit. Think of the Ethiopian eunuch, the royal official, reading Isaiah in a language of power that still left him hungry. Philip runs alongside his chariot and asks a question that is still the only honest one. Do you understand what you are reading? Or the answer echoes across centuries. How can I unless someone guides me? Ethiopia has been guiding the world longer than most people remember, not by shouting, but by preserving. Ink as testimony, chant as archive. Now we step into the image, literally. The Western Christ that fills textbooks and Sunday school walls is a portrait made when princes discovered the usefulness of piety. But walk into a rock-hewn church at Lalibela and tilt your head back. The ceiling floats like a stone sky, and the face looking down into your life is not a Roman emperor disguised as a shepherd. It's a neighbor, dark skin that knows the scorch of the same sun. hands whose wounds look less like jewelry and more like work. A Messiah embedded in the life of the people, not hovering above it. You can spend an hour just watching the icon's gaze, and you'll feel it. Truth doesn't always need a thesis. Sometimes it simply needs a face that refuses to lie. What happens when you change a face? You change a faith. Imagine a child looking up at a Christ who looks like them, their hair, their features, their family's grief and laughter, and hearing, "I am with you." That child will not be easy to colonize. That mother will not kneel to anyone wearing a crown that demands she forget her dignity. Compare that to a captive forced to bow to an image that resembles her captor. The gospel curdles on the tongue. Iconography is theology with pigment. That's why the brush became a battlefield. Let's pick up a different weapon now. The word Lucifer. We've been told this name is a proper noun, born in a heaven that cracked with war. But when you trace the line of that word back, you find a poet's taunt to an earthly king, and then you watch how centuries of fear fed it into a myth grand enough to frighten empires into order. This isn't about proving anyone stupid or lying. It's about watching how interpretations grow muscle when they serve the needs of thrones. If a ruler can say, "Rebellion is diabolical by definition," then obedience is no longer ethics, it's survival. But the mountains of Ethiopia were never impressed with that kind of logic. They took the texts as they were, let the poetry remain poetry, let the kings be kings, and met the devil in a different court. Here's where the air thins. Close your eyes again and picture a courtroom lit by something brighter than sunlight. Files stacked not on wood, but on memory. Witnesses who are not called so much as they simply appear. A voice like a river says, "Where have you come from?" And an answer comes back like gravel sliding down a slope, from going to and fro on the earth. The accuser does not leap upon the judge's throne. He does not wield final power. He asks questions with teeth. He insinuates. He cross-examines the heart. In this court, suffering is not a stunt for spectacle. It is a furnace. Fire doesn't ask your permission. It asks what in you can survive heat. Job knew this. Paul understood the thorn. It's not romantic. It's not cruel. It's real. Do not mistake this for softening evil. To say the accuser is permitted is to say the surgeon is permitted to cut. It hurts. It bleeds. It exposes. But nothing in this court is arbitrary. The leash exists, and the one who holds it is not nervous. In that knowledge, courage begins to grow. If trial has a boundary, then endurance has a path. If the question is allowed, then a truthful answer can be forged. Night does not become less dark because we say so. It becomes survivable because morning has an appointment that night cannot cancel. Now let me take you to a table, a small one, with a chipped edge and a single candle in a chipped cup. Two students sit with coffee gone cold, an icon propped between them, an article on Roman cannon formation open on the phone, and a photocopy of a GEZ page that smells faintly of the library that let it out for an hour. One student says, "So are you saying the West lied?" The other shakes her head. "I'm saying the West simplified." Then she points at the icon, Christ not crowned like an emperor but haloed like a witness, and whispers, "What if the simplification was designed to keep us manageable?" They fall quiet. The candle gutters. The page with the watches and the chains waits. The question remains floating between them like a test that is not graded yet. Walk with me from that table back into the city, any city. Billboards glow with slogans. News feeds slide with stories that choose you before you choose them. This is how the accuser works when he isn't wearing horns. He writes drafts. He offers versions of reality where you are small, where only fear makes sense, where love is a liability, where faith looks like passivity or like rage, but never like resilient hope. He offers conclusions that feel like safety. All authority is holy, all rebellion is evil, all suffering is meaningless, all doubts are treason. And if you accept any one of those without testing it in the court, you start living a story you didn't write. Remember the monk turning the page. He knows something we're relearning. You cannot defeat a lie by shouting at it. You defeat it by telling a better story and then inhabiting it long enough that your life becomes evidence. The Ethiopian witness does not rely on arguments. It relies on survival. Crosses carved with infinite knots speak a grammar of eternity. Stone churches that breathe for 8 centuries say more about the substance of a faith than any army's banner. When the West revised its art to flatter its kings, Ethiopia kept painting the Christ who eats with the poor. When councils closed the canon to strengthen a center, the mountains kept copying Enoch because the people could taste truth in its thunder. When empires taught order by fear, priests taught order by fasting and prayer and the slow discipline of remembering. I want you to feel the weight of that remembering. See a grandmother teaching a child to cross himself with a hand that carries the tremor of a life that has outlasted droughts and wars. Hear a choir that knows every crack in the church's ceiling because they watched the rains test it year after year. Notice how none of that requires permission from any capital. That is what it means for a tradition to carry its own center. That is why other centers feel threatened by it. You cannot rule people who know how to endure. Hold on to that thought as we move into the art again. We pull Renaissance canvases beside Ethiopian icons, not to stage a fight, but to read signals. One inscription whispers hierarchy, another sings compassion. One leans hard on distance and spectacle, the other leans into presence. Neither image can contain Christ, but one image trains us to expect him in places he did not promise to live, while the other dares us to see him where he said he would be. In the hungry, the sick, the imprisoned the least. When a culture stares long enough at an enthroned Christ, framed by architecture, it starts confusing sanctuaries with palaces. When a people stare long enough at a Christ whose cloak is dusty, whose friends are fishermen and mothers and beggars, they start expecting holiness to interrupt their porches, not just their processions. Keep walking. A market street, the smell of coffee and cardamom, a line of women in white shawls moving toward a doorway. Inside, the priest begins the chant. It sounds like earth remembering rain. That sound cannot be legislated. It does not ask approval. It says, "We were here, we are here, we will be here." And the accuser hates that language because it cannot be frightened into silence. Endurance is a dialect that breaks his grammar. If you're wondering where scripture stands in all this, place your hand on the page. Let the ink stain your fingertips a little. The canon debates were never only about history, they were about imagination. Which rhythms would we let into our sanctuaries? Which voices would shape our sense of time and trial? The presence of Enoch and Jubilees in Ge'ez did more than add information. It tuned the soul to a cosmos, alive with accountability, where angels are not ornamental, where kings serve at the pleasure of a judge they cannot bribe, where floods and exiles are not just political, but metaphysical punctuation marks. People who pray inside that narrative expect to be tested, not crushed, tested. And people who expect testing do not panic when it arrives. They measure it, name it, outlast it, and come out with a calmer fire in their eyes. Let me tell you about one of those eyes. An old mason who worked on reinforcing a centuries-old church told a scholar that every stone is a psalm if you set it right. If you set it proud, he said, running his hand along the edge, the rain will laugh and take it. If you set it humble, he pressed, the wall will sing. That is theology without footnotes. That is the gospel of endurance. That is also the strategy that makes the accuser furious, because his best tricks assume we will either grow arrogant or despairing. Humility ruins both. Humility doesn't mean silence in the face of a lie. It means patience in the service of truth. It means learning history without turning it into hatred. It means looking at Western misuses of Jesus without turning away from the real Jesus when he walks in wearing any culture's clothes. It means letting Ethiopia teach you without making Ethiopia your idol. It means refusing to trade one imperial Christ for another, because Christ doesn't belong to empires and he is not impressed by our flags. Now feel the ground tilt again toward the courtroom. The accuser steps forward with a familiar argument. These people only love you because you bless them, touch their money, their bodies, their reputations, and watch their piety break. He has used this motion since Job. He gets it granted often, but never without limits. You may not like that, I don't either, but somewhere a widow kneels and prays the same two sentences she prayed before the storm and after the storm, and the court records it. Somewhere a prisoner sings under his breath. Somewhere a young mother shares the last of her bread. Somewhere a man deletes the comment he wanted to post, because truth has no need for that kind of victory. The court sees all of it. This is not sentimental. It is procedural. The cosmos is not a circus. It's a case. In that case, images matter as evidence, texts matter as exhibits, lives matter as testimony. Ethiopia brings all three with a steadiness that has no need to shout. When councils trimmed the library, they kept copying. When painters flattered kings, they kept painting neighbors. When the myth of a tidy fall became a broom to sweep dissent, they kept telling the slower, harder story of testing. And because that story is slower and harder, it is also harder to sell, which is why you did not learn it in school. But here you are now, listening, and something in you recognizes the shape of it, because your life has already taught you that trials are more common than lightning bolts, and that the deepest victories rarely make headlines. So here is where I want you to breathe. The long breath you take when you know you will be sitting in the gallery for hours, and you brought a notebook because you intend to understand the trial, not just cheer at the verdict. We are going to keep reading the record. We are going to bring Western interpretations and Ethiopian testimony into the same light, not to humiliate one or worship the other, but to gather a fuller picture of the judge, the witnesses, the law, and the way mercy threads through the whole proceeding like a quiet river under stone. We will listen to the prophets without forcing them to talk about angels when they were talking about kings. We will listen to homilies and hymns that describe the tester not as a free tyrant, but as an instrument whose handle he cannot touch. We will let the icons keep looking at us until we notice how our posture changes, when we remember that the face of Jesus belonged to a man who never sat on a throne and never swung a sword and yet never lost a battle worth winning. And as we move forward, watch what begins to happen to the fear you were handed in childhood. It does not vanish. It changes temperature. It stops scaring you into obedience and starts warning you into wisdom. It stops paralyzing and starts sharpening. The accuser cannot use terror on people who have trained their lives to pray while the fire is still in the room. He switches to subtler weapons then: flattery, shortcuts, fashionable cynicism, the luxury of despising. Those are harder to notice, which is why we'll need all the witnesses: Enoch's thunder, Job's ash heap, Paul's thorn, Mary's song, the monk's candle, the mason's stone, the grandmother's hand, the child's icon, to remind us where we are and who is watching. Keep your place in the record now, because the next pages turn slowly and the ink is dense. We're about to follow the thread into how songs shape trials, how fasting interferes with the accuser's schedule, how feast days teach the body to remember what the mind forgets, how the calendar itself, when tuned to the right canon, becomes a weapon against despair. Then we will open the art again, this time alongside the economics that paid for it, and we'll ask which patrons benefited from which faces, and how the poorest worshippers still managed to keep their Christ close enough to touch. After that, we will step into the wilderness where the tester met Jesus face to face and could not find a purchase, and we'll draw that map onto our own appetites and ambitions until we can see exactly where the stones still look like bread and where the pinnacles tempt us to jump. And now, think back to where we began, with a whisper in the mountains, a page turned in a monastery, and a question that dared to challenge everything you thought you knew about Lucifer, about Christ, about the very shape of Christianity itself. We have traveled far since then, through Ethiopia's stone churches and hidden manuscripts, through images painted in the likeness of neighbors instead of emperors, through scriptures Rome erased and stories empire rewrote. Step by step, scene by scene, the thread has led us deeper into a vision the world tried to bury. We saw how Ethiopia, long before Europe crowned emperors in the name of Christ, had already baptized its kings. We saw how their canon stretched wider, holding books like Enoch and Jubilees, texts that unveil heavens alive with watchers, rebellions, and rhythms of time too dangerous for empire to sanction. We watched how Ethiopia carved endurance into rock, while Rome painted power into cathedrals. One faith bowed to councils, the other bowed only to memory. We walked into the courtroom of heaven itself, where the accuser is not a cartoon villain hurled down in one fiery fall, but a tester permitted to refine, to sift, to reveal. We learned that the danger is not only rebellion, but narrative, the lie that reshapes reality until obedience feels holy and resistance feels demonic. Rome weaponized that lie, Ethiopia resisted it, and in their witness, we discovered that Lucifer's true strength is not in rebellion, but in distortion, not in brute force, but in twisting the story you believe about yourself, about God, about the world. We stood beneath two faces of Christ, the pale Christ of empire, enthroned beside conquerors, and the black Christ of Ethiopia, walking with the oppressed, and we saw how a change of face reshaped the gospel itself, one preaching submission, the other liberation, one blessing thrones, the other blessing chains broken in the night. Iconography became theology, theology became politics, and politics became power. But Ethiopia never surrendered its face of Christ, never traded endurance for domination. And we uncovered how Isaiah and Ezekiel, once oracles against proud kings, were stretched into myths of a cosmic fall, useful for empire, terrifying for peasants. Yet Ethiopia remembered them as they were, warnings about human arrogance, not biographies of angels. The devil's reality was not denied, but his story was told differently, less about spectacle, more about testing, less about a lightning fall, more about the furnace of endurance. Through it all, one theme has bound every chapter together: endurance. Ethiopia endured invasions, councils, and centuries of dismissal. Its manuscripts endured when Europe forgot them. Its icons endured when art was whitewashed. Its theology endured when empire simplified the story, and endurance itself became a testimony louder than conquest. So what have we seen? That truth is bigger than empire's canon, that Christ is nearer than empire's portraits, that Lucifer's role is subtler than empire's myth, and that Ethiopia, silent and steadfast, preserved a Christianity older, stranger, and more dangerous than the world was ready to admit. Now the question turns to us, because the courtroom is still in session, the tester still whispers, the advocate still speaks, the manuscripts still breathe, and the face of Christ still asks, which story will you live by? The empire's narrative of fear and control, or the enduring witness of a gospel that walks with the oppressed, that tests through fire, that sings even in chains? This is the heart of everything we have uncovered. Ethiopia shows us that Christianity was never about empire, never about palaces, never about crowns. It was always about endurance, always about truth, always about a Christ who looks like his people, and a courtroom where every trial refines the faithful. And so we stand here with the weight of manuscripts, the gaze of icons, the echo of chants, the fire of trials, and the whisper of endurance. We stand knowing that Lucifer's fall may not be what we thought, and that the real battle is not his rebellion, but our belief. Because the greatest war has always been about stories, and the greatest question has always been, which story will you choose? Stay with me, because what comes next will take us even deeper into that choice. The journey isn't over. It has only just begun.